Welcome to the Now to Next podcast, where every week we provide wisdom on how to press play after a traumatic pause. If you are starting up or starting over in any area of your life or your business, subscribe and listen as we share real life stories from actual people who have pressed play and are winning after nearly losing it all. And now, your host, Octoria Robinson.
Hi there, friends. Are you ready to press play today? I am so excited to have Lory in the studio with us today. How are you?
I am good. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes, we are very excited about hearing your story. But before we go there, because I can get a little antsy, I want you to share a little bit about yourself so our listeners can know who they're connecting to.
Sure. I am 53 years old. I live in the Midwest, Wisconsin. I'm actually a Florida transplant to the Midwest, if you can imagine that. I have 8 grandchildren. I homeschool a teenage daughter, and I have 2 adult daughters. So I'm married to my best friend, and I'm here buried in the snow and ice right now.
I must admit, I love the snow, but it's probably because I've never lived in the snow.
It loses its magic about Valentine's Day, and then I'm pretty over the fascination.
That's what my son tells me all the time. But again, thank you so much for being on the show today. Just as a reminder for our first-time listeners out there, guys, our podcast, Now the Next, is about helping you, yes, you, press play after trauma. We know it's unwelcome, it's uninvited, and it just creates all sorts of havoc, but it is essential that we learn how to not escape trauma, but heal and become whole after it. I believe that Lory's story is really going to inspire a ton of people today. So without further ado, I will allow her to go ahead and get started. I can't wait to hear it myself.
Well, I appreciate that. And I have to tell you that trauma doesn't have a favorite. It's indiscriminate. And so even my early childhood trauma plays into the way that I respond to trauma, even in adulthood. And so actually nothing could have prepared me for the trauma that I'm going to share with you guys today. I have and have had for a long time daughters, and I raised those daughters primarily by myself. And one of my daughters got lost in a meth addiction for about 10 years. And in those 10 years, I learned to war and worship and wait. I learned to teach others to do the same. And the Lord really did prop me up in a way that gave me a place to really invest what I was believing Him to deliver in my life for others. And so we taught a group of women, my mama Linda, who God has given me, and myself, we taught a group of women how to pray and war and wait while I waited for Him to deliver my own daughter. And we had scriptures that we stood on, and we gathered together weekly. And we taught these women how to pray, how to worship, how to wait. Actively waiting was the way that we were going to engage in this battle. And my daughter had been separated from me. She went to Oklahoma. And so the stories that I heard were from long distance. And I had always held to a promise that God would bring my child back from the land of the enemy. And that was in Jeremiah 31:16. And He told me to be of good courage and to get to work and to stop my weeping. And those two things exist in those 2 verses, Jeremiah 31:16 and 17. And because of that instruction, that is exactly what we did. So we simply obeyed the word and waited. And it was about 10 years that it took for my child to leave the meth addiction, to actually come out of her insanity. And that insanity was stopped really by the birth of her last son. And he was born to a mom who tested positive for meth during labor. And DHS in Oklahoma came and took this little boy after day 2. She was able to name him, and she had to say goodbye. And it was in those moments following leaving the hospital that she had to come to grips with a decision, and that was either step off a curb in front of a bus and die, or live and get her sons back. And that is exactly what she did. She called me that afternoon, got herself checked in to a hospital, and we were together, at least in heart from that point on. And she would call for instruction, and we would really ask the Lord what to do next, because every single step for the next 3 years was very precarious. And she did everything that she was supposed to do. She got her sons back. She was the model for reunification. She was on probation, and her probation officer and I had several conversations about, you could have checked the box of model citizen. And then she came home. And she came home under duress, that is, under circumstances that would have been less than favorable. She was actually fleeing a still violent and addicted husband. And she had to protect her sons from that kind of violence. And she got in the car and drove herself all the way home. And when she got home, I really thought it was the fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:16 and 17. And I celebrated, oh my word. And I took that promise and I ran with it in my imagination. I could see us standing, fulfilling the promise of God to me to minister to other women that had been so devastated by this kind of addiction, and their lives wrecked and their families devastated. And I thought, oh my word, this is it. We're going to minister together. I can see it. And I could all but see it. And then 4 months after her arrival, she got very, very sad. And she advocated for herself like a champion. She went to doctor after doctor after doctor. She would go to the emergency room and present there and say, I am really struggling just to stay alive. And they would pat her on the head, tell her not to hurt herself, and send her home. She went in once having overdosed on Tylenol, and they told her, well, you've got an appointment on Monday, so let's just get to Monday. Don't hurt yourself, and you can see your counselor then. Disappointment after disappointment after disappointment, my child signed a contract that was really an oversight of the court. It was an intervention, a crisis intervention contract that she would submit to even oversight by the court system, and she would oversee them. The court would oversee her for 6 months. And so she checked herself into a long-term behavioral hospital in Winnebago, Wisconsin. We expected for her to be there about 6 to 8 months. And 8 days later, they checked my child out with vitamin D and a pat on the head. And 24 hours later, Morgan shot herself and her 2 sons. She lived for 11 days in the ICU unit, where God graciously gave me a chance to worship and war and pray over her the songs of deliverance that He had given me. He gave me a chance to tell her goodbye and to tell Him thank you. That I knew that the work that she had done to come to the Lord was not going to be in vain. And when she left this earth, I knew exactly where she was going to go. But that doesn't make it hurt any less. And on the other side of the hospital, I had a little boy who was 8 years old who survived. And so he still lives to this day. And we have no contact with him. So basically that day I lost my daughter and my 2 grandsons. There was a 6-year-old grandson, Jackson, who died at the scene. And it was from that moment I did not need to wrestle with God. I never blamed God, because God had so prepared me to wait and worship and war for her deliverance that I now needed to wait and worship and war for my own.
Wow.
And I went home to Michigan and spent the next 9 months standing in the front with my hands in the air, worshiping and waiting until the agony could leave. God had given my pastor's wife visions, my youth pastor words of knowledge. So even before my arrival back home without my daughter, God had gone before me to give me a voice and to give me a word of hope and to tell me exactly what His heart was on the matter. And nothing else in a trauma matters except for the heart of the Father.
My God, Lory, oof. That's heart gripping. Thank you for sharing. But we want to express our condolences for your loss. My God. I hear it and I feel it, even listening to you, the amount of faith and strength that it must have taken to stand in that moment. You said you were prepared to war, to wait, and to worship. What did that look and feel like on a day-to-day basis over those next 9 months?
Or the after effects when I walk into my own trauma having to use those skills? Which one do you mean?
Goodness, both. Because it sounds like the preparation allowed you to stand and war through for your own deliverance.
Right. So I don't think that we ever come to any kind of battle that God hasn't prepared us with a battle before. And I think that that's a biblical principle. If you look at Abraham, he was set up to be the father of many nations. And he was set up by simple choices that he had to make before he ever walked into that promise. And David is the same. David had killed a lion and a bear before he ever faced Goliath. And those two kind of tests that he himself talked about had prepared him to stand in front of Goliath in the proper position to say, "How dare you?" And honestly, that was my position. How dare you? How dare you make my child so sad she couldn't stay? But I want to tell you that when I came home to Michigan and I got the phone call that she had died, I couldn't stay at the hospital to watch her leave. My husband and I had made an agreement that we would leave before she did. There is no way that I could have waited until she died beside her bed. I knew where she was headed, and I chose to leave the hospital before she did. And so we had come home to Michigan, and I gave a phone call back to the ICU unit, and I talked to the nurse that day and asked her how my daughter was. And she said, "Lory, I just want you to know that she breathed her last at 10:30 this morning." She said she took 4 deep breaths. One tear ran down her left cheek, and she was gone. And I know that it was in those very last moments that the clouds rolled back and she saw Jesus face to face, and everything that I had ever told her, prophesied over her, prayed for her, or taught her was true in that moment. And I know where she is to this day. And in that very moment, I had already bought months ago tickets because I was launching a book about overcoming disordered eating. And Mama Linda and I were to appear at a conference in Florida. And then after having booked my flight, I got the phone call that my daughter had shot herself and her sons. And so my position in heart was, how dare you, you punk devil, that you would make this any difficult at all. But I'm telling you that I will breathe every breath of the rest of my life, making your life miserable. And that was my position, because I know who I can trust, and it is him who keeps us. Even our very cells are held together with the rebar of laminin, and it is shaped in the shape of the cross. I know who holds me together. And so those very next days, those 9 months post losing my daughter and my grandsons, were simply filled with knowing who I could trust. And I rested under the agony of the lead coat of grief for a long time. And I would drag myself and my children to church, and we would stand in the front with our hands raised and worship and wail and weep. And I would show up and be present in every single conference that would minister any kind of hope and deliverance to me. And my testimony has always been and still is, I know now and I knew then in whom I could put my trust. And that's how I make it through. So I continue every day to remind myself that I can trust God. And sometimes I would tell myself that over and over and over through the day. I know I can trust you. I cannot see it. I cannot feel it. But I know that I don't have to understand, because you are trustworthy. And then you remind yourself of the 1,000,000 times before that he's shown up on your behalf. Those are the lions and the bears that you recount when you're standing in front of Goliath.
My goodness. Now, Lory, you have shared your story well. Your courage to express it in the details, and I can feel it, and I'm sure our listeners can feel it as well. honey, you have a power in you that is palatable. I appreciate you deeply. But I'd like for you to begin to speak directly to our listeners regarding this statement that I'm going to share. How does someone heal who doesn't have that same foundation as you came into your sudden loss with? I'm thinking about a mom or a dad out there who has unfortunately lost their child and their grandchildren or even more, but they don't have the foundation that you came in to that loss with. What would you say to them right now to encourage and speak hope into their journey?
Well, I can tell you that I believe that God actually gave me an answer to that in the last few days in really looking over my life and reckoning what it was that prepared me for that kind of vigilance in front of my kind of Goliath. And I believe it's this, that in every life, in every single life, there is a single voice that speaks to us, and God always gives them to us, and they always speak of better things because that's the heart of the Father toward us. And in every life, there will be one person, maybe even on the periphery, that will say, you can do this. It's going to be okay. I know it's ugly. And they partner with us in our pain, in our grief, and they do not run. And when I look back over my life, I know that from the very beginning of any kind of trauma in my life to this very day, there has always been one of those voices. I say, look for that voice. Listen for that one voice who's telling you that it's not okay now, but they're there for you. There is nothing that can be said that can make that okay. Saying nothing is also not very encouraging. And many people back away from us when we're in that kind of level of grief. And so I just say, listen for the one voice that is telling you that you can live, that you can breathe again, that it won't last like this forever. It may never be as it once was. It can't. But it will be different than it is right now.
Wow. So I'm thinking again on that same listener. They're saying, I hear you, Lory. I want to find that one voice. But how do I silence the other voices that are so loud? The ones of hatred, the ones of disappointment, the ones of agony, the ones of guilt, the ones of all these negative emotions. They seem to swallow up this any type of hope. How do I silence those voices to actually hear the voice that genuinely matters and is going to get me on the other side in my heart and begin to see life from the lenses of hope?
I love the question because the question actually tells us, even in your question, how do I? It even tells us that we can. If it were not possible, God would not ask us to do it. And he actually answered that question. And it is a principle that I clung to during those really, really rough first 12 months. And that principle is this: think on these things, which are noteworthy, praiseworthy, of good report. It is to be intentional about what you're thinking about. And it is the most difficult time to apply that biblical principle ever, because your mind runs away with I should haves and I could haves and I wish I hads. And you are absolutely in charge of what you're thinking about. And in those times of real intense grief, those are the positions that you really do intentionally think about what you're thinking about and apply a biblical principle to that thinking. Go into the Psalms. David knew what it was to lose even a child, and he knew what it was to stand before the God of all the universe and say, I can't see it. I want to know where you are. I understand you're not coming to my rescue. I'm not happy about it, but I trust you because you are the God of the universe and the only one I can actually rely on. So I say, think about what you're thinking about and make that a worthy, worthwhile, noteworthy, praiseworthy thing to think about. And if you can do that, you can do that every moment. You can do that in the moment, then you can get to the next day and do it again.
Wow. That's some powerful wisdom right there. Now, my next and final question is a really sensitive one, but I feel it's important that they hear from you on it because you carry this level of grace to communicate on such a delicate topic. Now, some may say, Lory, how did you manage to keep your love on for your daughter after her challenges in life not only cost her life, but also you lost your grandkids? That may seem absolutely impossible for someone to continue their love in such a steadfast way as you've described. Can you help someone who might be right there today struggling with keeping their love on?
I think so. I hope so. I can only tell you that my daughter wasn't the problem. I can tell you that my daughter didn't have the kind of foundation in faith that she needed, and she simply didn't have the strength. My daughter was not the one to be mad at. The word tells us very plainly that there is an enemy against our soul, and he hates us entirely. He hates us so completely that it is nothing for him to take the life of my child or my grandchildren, or separate and devastate a family, or leave an orphan who I'm now raising. He doesn't care about any of that because we are beloved by God, and that is the reason that he hates us so completely. So to understand who the enemy, who the responsible party is in this thing, that really was how I could position my heart to continue. It was how I could not blame myself or my daughter, because neither one of us, while maybe culpable, certainly responsible for decisions that were made, without a doubt, ultimately, this was an absolute devastating onslaught by the enemy. And I know who he is, but he is a defeated punk, and I am clear as to what his position is to the Father I trust.
Wow. I tell you one thing, I'm holding back my tears. Your story, Lory, your love, your faith, your unrelenting faith, it's in every response and how you've expressed your journey and all that has happened in this aspect of your life is evident that you are a firm believer in God. And I genuinely thank you on behalf of every person that will listen to this podcast. I know without a doubt you have unleashed hope that was bound to something that the enemy convinced someone another reason as to why it occurred, but you've unleashed hope to bring clarity in their hearts and their minds. And I believe a lot of restoration of hope, peace, joy, and love will be established in so many people's lives who will listen to this podcast. Lory, with that said, as much as I want to hear so much more, I know we're wrapping up on time, but I want to make sure every person that needs to connect to you knows how to connect with you. Can you share with our listeners how they can follow and grow with you in your journey?
Absolutely. We are actually just now finishing up the final aspects of our website, The Revolutionary Hearts. We have built a collective, a team of folks that specialize in overcoming trauma. We are we range from 72 to 30. We have built about grief, around disordered eating, around becoming a widow, and we want to wrap around women who are seeking to overcome. We believe that we can really speak into their lives and just help them to finish business that gets unfinished. And the story that I always like to tell very quickly is this. There was a little girl who was in the dark of her safe room, and she was very scared, and she called her mom, and her mom came running down the hall, and she said, "What is it?" She said, "I'm scared, I'm afraid." And the mom said, "Well, just trust Jesus." And the mom went back to her room, and the little girl calls out again, and she was still afraid in the dark, and her mom comes running back to her room and says, What is it?" And she says, "I'm still afraid. I asked Jesus, but I'm still afraid." And the mom says, "Well, you can just pray and trust Jesus. And the mom said, maybe, but I need Jesus with skin on right now. And I believe that when we have overcome trauma, it's not only our privilege, our call, but it is our responsibility to be that Jesus with skin on. So for anyone who needs support, arevolutionaryheart@gmail.com, and I'll get you connected with the social media stuff we're setting up right now.
Wow. Thank you again, Lory, and we'll keep our prayers on for you and your ministry and all the great work that you are doing to help people heal and become whole after trauma. To all my listeners, remember, trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story. We believe it should look like you have triumphed over all that was opposing you, all the negativity, all of the pain, all of the guilt, all the shame, whatever form it's come at you. We believe that you have the capacity and ability to overcome it. Until we meet again, you guys have an extraordinary week.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast today. For all things Launch Now, log on to launchnowus.com for info on products, resources, and upcoming events. We are looking forward to connecting with you and enriching your life through our next episode. And remember, you have what it takes to press play. Have a super duper epic week.